From Software are one of the most widely adored video game developers in the industry, and with their most recent entry, Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, they've shown they can very easily move past the Dark Souls series. Despite this, no game they've created has quite recaptured the magic of the first Dark Souls game. I'd like to clarify that I'm not saying Dark Souls 1 is my favourite From Software game, that could very well go to Bloodborne or even Dark Souls 3, but that's for another day. What I mean by this is that Dark Souls had a big impact on every single person who played it. Whether this was for good or bad reasons, very few games can say they are as iconic as the original Dark Souls. So, over the course of this video, I'll talk about why this game is so well loved and why overall it's iconic and a masterpiece. Everyone knows Dark Souls is difficult. That's what it's famous for. What makes this great, though, is that it pretty much always feels fair. Oh, well, except for Blighttown. Oh, and, actually this thing as well. Fuck this thing. Most of the time, the game will show you clear as day why you've died. Whether it's mistiming a dodge or being too greedy with attacks, you've seen exactly where you've gone wrong, and as a result, you'll do better next time. The risk-reward playstyle throughout this game really helps to create a feeling of excitement as you progress through it. Bonfires in this game are really scarce, but there are many shortcuts in every single area, and this slaps you in the face as soon as you enter Undead Burg, which is the first proper area of this game. Because of these shortcuts, the run back for a boss is really short usually, and bonfires are linked to many areas which relates to more world building, which I'll go into later. Going back to difficulty though, for anyone who doesn't know, bonfires are the checkpoint throughout pretty much the entire Dark Souls series, and when you rest at them, you regain your healing items, in Dark Souls' case, Estus Flasks. In Dark Souls 1 though, you can kindle a bonfire and this increases the amount of healing items when you get to respawn or rest at that bonfire. This, once again, implements a really nice risk-reward element into the game, as you have to debate whether to use your humanities to kindle a bonfire to help you if you're struggling with a boss or area. So you really have to think about which fires to kindle, because humanities aren't that common throughout the game. In short, Dark Souls teaches you its mechanics by, well, killing you. When you die to a certain attack, you'll learn its tell and dodge it next time, or the same thing with an environmental hazard, or those dumbass skeletons near the catacombs, etc., etc. Some people really won't like this almost trial and error style of learning, but honestly I think it works perfectly, because it really helps you to be urgent with your dodges and attacks, because you know what will happen if you slip up, because the game's hammered it into you time after time and time again. The difficulty in Dark Souls is not just there for the sake of it, it's there to teach you the game, and in my opinion it does an absolutely brilliant job of that. Nothing exemplifies this perfect balance of difficulty in Dark Souls more than the bosses. I could talk about the bosses in this game alone for the entirety of this video. I won't, but I could. The Dark Souls series and From Software games in general are known for having the best bosses in gaming, and in terms of bosses, I still think Dark Souls 3 or maybe even Bloodborne have the best showings in the series, but again, I'll talk about that another day. Despite that, Dark Souls 1 has some fantastic bosses, and you can't take that away from it because other showings in the series have been better. However, this video could get really scattered if I try to talk about all the bosses, but I'm going to focus on two bosses in particular and what makes them great individually. The first one I'm going to talk about is one that I'm sure any Dark Souls fan saw coming as soon as I started discussing bosses. The fight I'm talking about is, of course, Ornstein and Smough. The duo you find at the peak of Anor Londo is arguably one of the best moments in the entire series, and is definitely the peak of Dark Souls 1 to me. The speed of Ornstein is a nightmare to deal with, and his closing speed makes him a really difficult opponent one-on-one, and he is the one that you'll be most likely facing throughout the entirety of the fight, because he is so aggressive. Smough is generally the further back of the two, as he's much bigger and much slower, but he does absolutely massive damage, and this creates a fantastic contrast to the much quicker and more aggressive Ornstein. Balancing these two is known as the most challenging fight in Dark Souls, and for good reason. Well, in the main game anyway. But going back to my earlier point, if you're well leveled, this will never feel unfair. When you kill one, the other regains full health and gets amped up. While this might seem unfair at face value, dealing with one of these two is so much easier than dealing with both of them, even when one of them has a power-up. The surviving member also gets some extra attacks, but the balancing act there is gone, and to experience both sides of this fight, you're going to have to do it twice. This fight is mechanically perfect. There's a reason this fight pops up on every single top 10 bosses list I've ever seen, and a reason it's so iconic. Besting these two is the most satisfying thing you'll do throughout the entire game. It's really difficult, but it's completely fair, and I think this summarizes Dark Souls perfectly mechanically. The second boss I'm going to talk about here is the final boss of the game. Gwyn's theme alone is enough to make this fight iconic. This one isn't as impressive in terms of gameplay or mechanics. It's still a great fight, but if you can parry, it's a joke, and if you can't parry, it's arguably too difficult. But it's still a really fun fight to pull off mechanically. But the reason this fight is great is more about the atmosphere it creates and the impact it has on the narrative. All game, from the opening cutscene, Gwyn is built up to the player. This is the man who started off the Age of Fire, and he's the reason for all the events in the series happening, and he's sold for the entire game as some sort of all-powerful god. But once you get through the kiln and get past the last set of nights to reach this so-called god, you traverse the fog and you see nothing but a husk of a man. Nothing but a shell of the being Gwyn used to be. I'm not saying this fight is easy. Like I said, if you can't parry, it's one of the hardest fights in the game. But what I mean is that this fight is insanely tragic and really somber. The final boss of this game ends a complete masterpiece in an incredible way. There are other great bosses in this game, such as Calamite, Artorias, Sif, and a few others, but I feel like the two I've talked about just show what impact these bosses can have, even if the reaction they elicit from the player is really different. There is a reason that final boss creates such an emotional reaction though. When you beat Gwyn, the end of the game is presented to you with a final choice. It's not a grand moment, like most games would opt for here. It's almost a guilty feeling that rushes over you. What makes you any better than the man you just killed if you link the flame again? To really get into this though, we have to look at the main reason I think this game in particular is so loved. I think the reason this game is so much more iconic than any other From Software game is the world building and atmosphere it creates. That is what makes this game a masterpiece for me. This is not only due to the top-notch areas in the game, but also the order they're placed in throughout the game. I briefly mentioned shortcuts earlier on in the video, and I think this is the best place to talk about it in depth. The shortcuts play a massive part in not only the areas in particular, but the game as a whole. Let's take Firelink Shrine for an example. On the surface, this area is just the first place this dude dumps you after the opening tutorial area. I don't think anyone realised just how connected this place is to the rest of the world the first time they played the game. They really make you feel like Firelink is the heart of the world here. These are the areas Firelink Shrine directly connects to. The Undead Bergen Parish, the Valley of the Drakes, New Londo Ruins, the Catacombs, and finally the Kiln of the First Flame. All of these then link to their own individual areas, obviously other than the Kiln. This really helps the world feel interconnected, especially in the first half of the game when you can't just use bonfires to teleport around. This in turn leads to some fantastic world building, and also the placement of the areas is insanely well done. Again, to use an example here, I'm going to use the areas just after the Undead Berg to show how this is done. After the areas in the parish and the Berg, the next natural area of the game is the depths, and then Blighttown. These areas are really dark and dreary, and this almost helps to put a feeling of hopelessness into the player. If you decide to look around the swamp in Blighttown though, you find a deviating path, leading into an area called the Great Hollow, and once you make your way through this tree, you find a passage to Ash Lake. This place is beautiful. Almost peaceful. A giant, bright beach is a perfect contrast to what you've just been through, and gives the player a huge relief and fills you with excitement and even hope. But then you have to go through Blighttown again. When you get out the other side of this hell pit, you get to Sen's Fortress, which is a towering, intimidating building, and this is essentially a fun house of traps and environmental hazards. Generally though, this area is so much nicer to traverse than either of the underground ones, and it gives you this feeling of ascension, like you're building towards something at the top, which, of course, you are. You have an epic fight with a golem at the top of the fortress, even though it's not the best mechanically, it's a really cool looking fight. You get to what is the peak of the game, and the best area in the series, Anor Londo. Something about this place just feels so special, and like you've had to earn your place to get here. Which of course, like I said, you really have done. After getting through this aesthetically gorgeous area and fighting through the massive castle, you get to fight these two. Like I said, this truly is the peak of the game, and it feels so earned because of what's preceded it. Blighttown, the depth, Sen's Fortress, ringing the two bells. This feels so difficult to get to, and this makes it feel really satisfying. Even though this does kick off an arguably weaker second half of the game, it's still leading up to the fight with Gwyn and your destiny to link the flame. However, you start to see just how damaged this world is, and this starts to put an idea in the player's mind that maybe the cycle needs to end and a new age has to come in. This is the choice you have at the end of the game, and whatever you choose, you get the haunting end credits song, solely titled Nameless Song. This leaves you thinking if the choice you made was even right, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. Your choice determines when this world dies, not if. This almost lack of purpose and hope is something the game drives home constantly, and this ending only works because of the setup that's being established for the entire game. And it's perfect. Even though the game, like I said, gives you some blemishes of hope and peace, like the overall feeling of Firelink Shrine or the beautiful views of Ash Lake, despair is the main theme of this game. And this is why it's perfect, and the reason it's one of a kind. Just to try and wrap this video up a little bit in some sort of conclusion, I've kind of just spoken about why I like this game so much and why I think it's so iconic, but for me it's this third reason. This game does not have the best bosses in the series, and I think difficulty progression is way better shown in Bloodborne, and I think the bosses are better in Dark Souls 3, but this third point, going into the world design, is something that not only FromSoft haven't been able to replicate, but very few games in general have been able to replicate. There's a reason this game is seen as one of the best of all time, and I agree. It's a flawed masterpiece, but a masterpiece nonetheless.